Thank you for tuning into this video on bureaucracy, which really is the large component of the executive branch. The president may be seen as the leader of the executive branch, but the bureaucracy is actually the component that does things. They implement the policies, they implement the laws, they actually enforce the laws that are created by Congress. Now, they're often seen as kind of being filled with paperwork and filled with having too many agencies and being expensive, but without them we wouldn't see a lot of things get done. And hopefully from our projects on different agencies, you can see that they do a lot of different stuff that people find very valuable for the United States. So it's tough to cut back on the different agencies and departments that kind of make up our bureaucracy. For much of our history, bureaucracy wasn't really impartial. Today, they're expected to be impartial. They're expected to not get involved with political campaigns. They're expected to not necessarily represent a specific political party or candidate. In fact, at one point in time, the president used to use what we call the spoils system, which means that when they took office, they hired a bunch of people that supported their campaign. So they did what we would call patronage. And that's when you give special favors or jobs to people that supported you when you were running for office. So presidents would basically fire everyone for bureaucracy and replace them with their friends and supporters. And we'd constantly have this changing of who's in our bureaucracy, which didn't lead to any consistency. So what we did is we created what's called the Pendleton Act. And the Pendleton Act basically establishes what we call a merit system. So people are hired and promoted in the bureaucracy based on merit, so based on performance. So you hire people for positions in the EPA if they've had experience in fields that would pertain to that. And you hire people to work for Department of Justice if they have experience being like a lawyer or working in the legal system. So that plays a major role in determining who gets promoted and who gets jobs in bureaucracy. And this makes the bureaucracy more impartial and function better because people aren't getting replaced constantly. There is no spoils system really anymore. And the only patronage you can really do is choosing the cabinet department heads and the department secretaries and the assistant secretaries. So kind of the top of the bureaucracy is replaced with every presidency, but a good chunk of the bureaucracy, about 95% of the bureaucracy, kind of stays the same and isn't affected by the presidential election, except for that their policies and laws might change. And if you want to move up in your bureaucracy, instead of supporting a presidential candidate, you just do well at your job. And that's how you move up in the system. So they've become more impartial. They've become more based on a merit system as opposed to a spoils system. And we've created basically a hierarchical system. So where there's you have a department secretary, and underneath them there's an assistant department secretary, and there's all these different agencies, and it's very much a hierarchy of different positions in the bureaucracy. And lastly, what's really important also is what we've done is we've created what's called the Hatch Act. And the Hatch Act is a law similar to the Pendleton Act, trying to make our bureaucracy as impartial and fair as possible. And the Hatch Act basically says that as long as you're in a bureaucratic position, you shouldn't be campaigning or joining a campaign or running for office. It's trying to get you out of the election and campaigning system, so it doesn't seem like you're favoring a specific candidate. So the bureaucracy, of course, is meant to be based on merit and meant to be not involved in campaigns. And it almost makes it like a fourth branch of our government because it does seem so separated besides the top, kind of the heads of the departments. Now, already hit on some of the myths with bureaucracy. A lot of people dislike bureaucracy and they kind of hate it because they see it as huge and ineffective, and they think all of bureaucracy takes place just in Washington, D.C. So I mean, bureaucracy is rather large to do a bunch of things, but a lot of people think that it doesn't actually get anything done, and it's just filled with miles and miles of paperwork and red tape and problems. And a lot of times when bureaucracy does good things, it doesn't necessarily get the credit. Congress or the president will try and take the credit, but bureaucrats don't go out there and tend to take kind of responsibility for good things. But when things go bad, you definitely see agencies taking the blame. For example, when there were problems with our emergency management during Hurricane Katrina, FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Administration, got a lot of the blame for those problems. Now, just to give you an idea of kind of fighting these myths, first of all, only 1/7 of our bureaucracy is located in Washington, D.C. So there are a lot of things that are outside of Washington, D.C. that are also part of the bureaucracy. In Wisconsin, we certainly have a component of the FBI here, and that's a part of the bureaucracy. And we certainly have IRS offices, and we have EPA agents that work in Wisconsin, and there are parks and forests that are recognized and responsible to the different agencies that focus on that. And it's also important to realize that although bureaucracy seems pretty large, 2.7 million people, it only takes about 2% of all the U.S. jobs that there currently are. Now, I already mentioned that bureaucracy focuses on a hierarchy, and really it starts with the cabinet departments, which we covered in class. You have all these different cabinet positions, and they essentially run a department. So the Department of Defense, a Secretary of Defense, and the Department of State is ran by the Secretary of State. And a lot of the agencies that we have in our country fall under one of these departments. So we'll see on the following screens, we'll look at some of the organizational structures of some of these departments and how different agencies fall under them. Now, there are agencies that don't fall under any of these departments, and they get called independent agencies. So they're independent from the departments, but they yet handle a more narrow focus. Some examples of independent agencies might be like NASA or the CIA, the NSF, or the EPA. They all focus on different things that could theoretically fit under a department, but they've been given their own separate independent executive agency. Now, we also have independent agencies that focus on regulation, which means they go out there and they set rules that companies and Americans have to follow. And there's a long list of those. A great example is like the Food and Drug Administration. They send out representatives from their agency to regulate our food and our drugs, meaning that if you have lettuce that was produced in Georgia, they know whether or not it's going to be safe. They're checking in on those companies to make sure that they're using the right procedures to make sure that lettuce is safe. So making sure it's washed and it's packaged properly to make sure that when you eat it, you're not getting E. coli or anything like that. Or the NLRB, which is the National Labor Relations Board, they focus on making sure companies are following our labor laws. So, for example, that children are not working in unsafe conditions, and that states are providing the correct paperwork, and that people aren't working extreme hours or in extremely unsafe conditions, that they're looking out for the safety of people. So these independent agencies, these independent regulatory agencies, focus on regulating and monitoring different parts of our country. Even something like the SEC, which focuses on the stock market and making sure people are following the rules and the laws in that realm. The last component, which is kind of like an agency, is what we call government corporations, which is essentially a government-run company. So we have some examples of this in the Amtrak in the U.S. Postal Service, where the U.S. provides a service through these agencies or government corporations, but those services are also charged for. So if you want to go on the Amtrak, you're going to have to pay. And if you want to send mail, you're going to have to pay. It's not just free or provided by the government, whereas you don't have to pay for the EPA to regulate companies. That's just paid for through tax dollars. But the post office and Amtrak don't make a ton of money. They're there really to make sure that we have a mail system and that we have a railroad system that functions. Now let's look a little bit at some of those cabinet departments that I promised that we would look at. First of all, you can see this is kind of our whole bureaucratic structure. Here you can see the different departments, you can see the different independent agencies, you can see the different agencies that fall under the President and the Supreme Court and the Congress as well. But if we look under a specific department, here's the Department of the Interior. And the Department of the Interior focuses on the resources and land management of our country. So, for example, the National Park Service is under the Department of Interior. And the U.S. Geological Survey, which focuses on surveying our lands and making sure our lands are well monitored. And the Office of Surface Mining and Reclamation and Enforcement is there. So they focus on our minerals and our mining and making sure our land is being properly utilized. And this all falls under the Secretary of the Interior. Here is the Secretary of Defense and the Department of Defense. So under the Secretary of Defense, there's a Deputy Secretary of Defense, but also you can see the different departments for different components of our military that need to function. So there's a lot of stuff going on underneath the Department of Defense, but it's one of the oldest departments that we have. And lastly, here's the Department of Homeland Security, which is our newest department. And really, it's swallowed up a lot of our agencies that we already had, like the Federal Emergency Management Agency has been put under the Department of Homeland Security, and like Customs is under Homeland Security, and our Immigration Service is under Homeland Security. So Homeland Security has been given a lot of agencies that were elsewhere, and now we deem them as important for this newer department that was created after September 11th. The last key thing to mention about bureaucracy is what we call the Iron Triangle, which is just the idea that underneath our government is basically a sub-government, where you have committees that are working with bureaucracy, and bureaucracy working with interest groups, and interest groups working with committees. And they're all functioning to help each other out, to help each other do their jobs. So, for example, interest groups might go to bureaucracy and lobby them and talk about different issues and concerns and share research, whereas bureaucracy might then in turn help out interest groups through modifying their programs and making sure that certain regulations meet the information that they received. Or, for example, bureaucracy may help out specific constituent groups that help out Congress people. And Congress people might focus on giving more budget to that department then. So there's a lot of give and take. There's basically a kind of a check and balance or give and take going on underneath our government between these three entities that really don't exist in our Constitution. So all these committees, all sharing information, all sharing kind of the responsibility of making sure our government functions and responds to the people.